Hey, you made it back. Welcome. I obviously didn't scare you off with the first two episodes. That's a good thing because things only get better from here. So yeah, you're welcome back. You're here, tuned into another episode of Man Bun, and I, I got so many comments about the Man Bun that I decided to opt for yet again another episode with the bun. Look, the problem is, what do you do with it when it's growing out? You're sort of stuck with it. All right. Anyway, so we're back again to look at this thing called causal analysis. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, especially where we look at time and space, please click on the link in the description, go back to that video, and just make sure you really understand what I mean when I'm talking about time and space and how we containerize space. Okay. Now, in today's video, we're going to step forward from that idea of time and space, and we're going to start to fill the space with objects. And this is really, really important. And again, it's important that you understand how we think of an object, how we frame an object, and what we do with that object once we try to capture it in what we call an element, okay, which you'll see in a later video. But for right now, we're going to look at objects, okay? Now, I'll mention something else. These videos right now, the first one, this one, and probably the next two, are not super difficult. They're not too hard, okay? But don't let the really simple examples throw you off and make you think that this is a really, really easy approach and a simple approach and it doesn't add a lot of value. I'm doing this intentionally to make sure that you have a good foundation and also to make sure that you're not thrown into the deep end too quickly, because what happens is we hit a curve and that curve is really steep. And as long as we've got a good handle on the fundamentals, the basics, then when we hit that curve, or we're having to think pretty deeply about how to create functions and how objects interact, you'll be much better prepared for that. Okay. All right. So let's see what we've got. Just flip over to my screen here. So this is where we started, right? We had this idea of time and space. And again, if you haven't seen this and you want to know more about it, you can click on the link in the description. But we talked about containerizing space. I use that example of a hospital. I also use the example of walking down the hallway and tripping. Okay, I said you step out and you trip over something. Okay, well, we're going to look at that something today and what that is. All right, so if we move down, when I run into folks who typically come from a Lean Six Sigma background, or it's not just Lean Six Sigma, it's that they've spent most of their career or most of their experience working in environments that deal with physical objects. Okay, your manufacturing environments, your logistics, right? Things like that. They're pretty well accustomed to dealing with those physical objects. But as soon as we move into a transactional environment, so a service business, things really fall apart when we start looking at causal analysis. And they have a really hard time understanding how to connect an object that is a physical object and an object that is a conceptual object, and somehow put those together in a picture to create some effect. Okay? So just know that in the back of your mind, if you're used to being in that physical environment, we're going to step out of that slightly today and really focus more on how we bring the full picture together. Okay? And this is also really, really helpful for people who do work in service environments. Okay? Because what you're probably used to seeing is lots and lots and lots of manufacturing and logistics examples and things like that. And you probably struggle a lot with how those things relate to your environment or how you can make sense of it within your environment. Okay, this is going to help you with that. So what is an object? This is really important. An object for us can be an entity or it can be an attribute of an entity. Okay, and I'll give you an example what that looks like down below. But it can also be either physical or conceptual. Now, physical you get. Now, Larry Ball and David Tronas have some fantastic examples of working with physical objects. They build a physics-based cause tree, and they do this in open source Triz. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And the test that David and Larry use is, can you drop the object on your foot? So when you're identifying objects for a physics-based cause tree, you want to know, like if I pick up a pen, can I drop it on my toe? Okay, that's how you know whether or not it's a physical object. If you start getting into data and things like that, well, there's nothing to drop on your foot, okay? But when we get into the analysis here, where we're using the causal landscape diagram, we do look at both physical and conceptual objects, okay, because they both matter. Think about data, right? Think about systems of measurement. Think about a kilometer, right? You're dealing with travel time. Think about things like perception and you just, any sort of thinking or contemplation on the part of the user, right? How do you capture that as an object? Okay, so we're going to look at some of those. And again, the other thing about when people tend to map these out, or they do 5 Ys or whatever, YY, it should be no, not YY. But when they do these kind of things, again, they get stuck on defining whether something is an entity or an attribute of an entity. And you'll see that when they're mapping or they're going through a workshop, they really get stuck. Like, well, should I be going after the attributes of that object? Like, is it heavy? Like, is the distance great? Is it far? Or are you going after the entity itself? Okay, and we'll look at this in just a second. But for us, an object it can be physical, it can be conceptual, it can be an entity, but it can also be an attribute, okay? So let's look at an example, right? A really, really simple physical object, right? I walk into that hallway and I trip over something, okay? So in this case, a physical object is like a brick, right? It's obvious. It's a physical object. You should be able to work this out pretty quickly. If you're in a manufacturing environment, it's any sort of tool, it's any sort of machine, it's the material that goes into the machine, things like that. When you're dealing with the conceptual object, though, think about data. Think about a field. Like if you're keying an input into a system, what is that field? Well, in our case, that field is a conceptual object, okay? So when we think about objects, we can pull any of those fields in. We can pull that entire digital environment into our causal analysis, okay? Now, what about the actual entities and the attributes themselves? Now, if you've played with any sort of entity attribute data models and things like that, then you're probably familiar with this. But the entity can be the complete picture, right? It can be, if you think about a user entering some information in, the entity might be the screen. It might be everything that they see, or the entity can be the individual field. Now you define that, and you define that level of description when you identify your object and you build your element, which we'll see in a subsequent video. But that is the entity. Now, when you talk about an attribute, okay, you're defining some characteristic of the entity, okay? So an entity can have multiple attributes. So in our case, we can take that specific field and we can say, it has 10 digits, or it has a certain height, or a certain width, or a certain depth, or a certain color, or it has some functionality that you've adapted to it or integrated with it, okay? So the features are descriptions about the entity. And when you identify an object, again, you could be identifying the object as an entity, or an object as an attribute, okay? So let's take that for today and let's just hold that thought now. So you've got time and space, and we're starting to fill time and space with objects. Objects can be physical objects, they can be conceptual objects, and then objects can either be entities or attributes, all right? So when we go into the next video now, we're going to build something called an element. And an element is what holds and containerizes these objects. But between now and this and then, or between this video and the next video, I want you to probably start having a think about different examples of objects in your specific environment. Okay, if you're in a law practice, a legal practice, what are the types of objects that you're dealing with? Okay, what about if you're a physician or a nurse? What types of objects are you dealing with? Okay, and again, if we think about service environments, we're looking at about 70. I think it's greater than 75%, maybe 78% of businesses are service businesses. Okay, so we're not necessarily always going to be tethered to physical objects. And when we build the causal landscape diagram, you'll have a nice blend of the two. Okay, so I hope this helps. We'll see you again for the next video. If this is helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and here we go.